Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The snow fell in thick, lazy spirals over Cedar Rapids on the evening of December 24th, 2016, coating the bare branches of oak trees and the peaked roofs of modest homes in a blanket of white that muffled the usual sounds of the city. Christmas lights blinked in windows up and down Birch Street, casting red and green reflections across the fresh powder, and the air smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. Inside the Harper household at number 42, the warmth of the season filled every corner. The kitchen windows fogged with steam from a pot of cider simmering on the stove, and the living room glowed with the soft light of a Douglas fir decorated with homemade ornaments and strings of popcorn. 8-year-old Emily Harper had spent the afternoon cutting snowflakes from white paper, her tongue poking out in concentration as she wielded the safety scissors her mother had given her. Her older brother, 12-year-old Daniel, sat cross-legged on the floor wrapping presents in newspaper comics because they had run out of proper wrapping paper, and their father hummed along to Bing Crosby on the radio while he untangled a stubborn knot of outdoor lights near the front door. Emily wore a purple sweater with a reindeer stitched across the front and mismatched socks, one striped and one with tiny bells that jingled when she walked. She was a small girl, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and eyes that seemed too large for her round face, eyes that noticed everything and forgot nothing. Her mother often said Emily lived in her own world, a place populated by imaginary friends and elaborate stories she would tell at the dinner table. Stories about princesses who lived in cloud castles and bears who played violins in moonlit forests. That afternoon, she had drawn a picture on a sheet of construction paper, a picture she pressed into Daniel's hands with great seriousness. The drawing showed a woman in a red coat standing beside a lamppost, and in the woman's hand was a pocket watch on a chain, the clock face carefully colored with a yellow crayon to suggest gold. Daniel glanced at the drawing and asked what it meant, and Emily said it was a secret, that the woman was someone who helped children find their way home when they got lost. Daniel ruffled her hair and told her she was weird, but he kept the drawing anyway, tucking it between the pages of a comic book on his nightstand. As dusk settled over Cedar Rapids, Emily's mother called the children to come inside for dinner, but Emily begged for just a few more minutes to play in the front yard. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky had turned a deep indigo, streaked with the last embers of sunset. Daniel agreed to watch her from the porch steps while he finished wrapping the last of his gifts, and their mother relented, reminding Emily to stay where Daniel could see her. Emily ran outside without her coat, her breath puffing in white clouds, and began building a small snowman near the mailbox. The neighborhood was quiet. Most families already gathered indoors for their Christmas Eve celebrations, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting golden pools across the snow. Daniel sat on the porch with his roll of tape and scissors, glancing up every few moments to check on his sister. He saw her pat the snowman's head, saw her crouch to gather more snow, and then he looked down to cut a length of tape. When he looked up again, Emily was gone. At first he thought she had darted around the side of the house to the backyard, something she often did when she wanted to surprise him. But when he called her name, there was no answer. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, scanning the front yard and the street beyond. The snowman stood half-finished beside the mailbox, and Emily's small footprints led away from it, down the sidewalk toward the corner where Birch Street intersected with Maple Avenue. Daniel called her name again, louder this time, his voice echoing in the cold air. Still no answer. He ran inside to tell his parents, his heart beginning to pound in a way that felt unfamiliar and frightening. Emily's father pulled on his boots and grabbed a flashlight, and her mother wrapped a scarf around her neck and followed him out the door, calling Emily's name into the gathering darkness. Daniel ran after them, his own voice joining theirs, and together they walked down Birch Street toward Maple Avenue, following the trail of small footprints in the snow. The prints led them around the corner and down the next block, past houses where families sat at dining tables and children pressed their faces to windows, waiting for Santa Claus. The footprints continued for 3 more blocks, growing fainter as the wind began to pick up and fresh snow started to fall again. At the intersection of Maple Avenue and 4th Street, the footprints disappeared entirely, swallowed by the swirling snow and the passage of a few cars whose tire tracks crisscrossed the pavement. Emily's father stood in the middle of the intersection, shining his flashlight in every direction, calling his daughter's name until his voice went hoarse. Her mother dialed 911 on her cell phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the numbers. Within 20 minutes, 2 police cruisers arrived, their red and blue lights painting the snow in garish colors. Officers took statements from the family, asking what Emily had been wearing, whether she had seemed upset or distracted, whether there was any place she liked to go when she wanted to be alone. Her parents answered as best they could, their words tumbling over one another in their desperation to be helpful, to give the officers something that might lead them to their daughter. Daniel stood beside them, clutching the drawing Emily had made, the picture of the woman in the red coat and the pocket watch, though he did not think to mention it at the time. He felt numb and distant, as though he were watching the scene unfold from somewhere far away. The police organized a search that night, calling in volunteers from the neighborhood and surrounding areas. Within 2 hours, more than 50 people had gathered at the corner of Maple Avenue and 4th Street, bundled in coats and gloves, carrying flashlights and calling Emily's name. They fanned out in groups, searching parks and playgrounds, checking behind dumpsters and inside unlocked sheds, knocking on doors to ask if anyone had seen a small girl in a purple sweater. The snow fell harder, turning the world into a blur of white, and the temperature dropped into the teens. Emily's mother walked with one of the search groups, her face frozen in an expression of anguish, her eyes scanning every shadow and alleyway. Emily's father stayed near the police command post that had been set up in a church parking lot, speaking to reporters who had arrived to cover the story, pleading into television cameras for anyone with information to come forward. By midnight, the search had expanded to include K9 units and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The dogs picked up Emily's scent near the theater district downtown, a cluster of old brick buildings that housed a community playhouse and a small independent cinema. The trail led the dogs to the front steps of the playhouse, where a marquee advertised a production of A Christmas Carol, then seemed to vanish. Officers searched the building from top to bottom, checking dressing rooms and storage closets, but found no sign of Emily. The helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight cutting through the snow, but the thermal cameras detected nothing unusual. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, the search was suspended due to the worsening weather. A blizzard warning had been issued, and visibility had dropped to near zero. The volunteers were sent home with promises that the search would resume as soon as conditions improved. Emily's family returned to their house on Birch Street, their clothes damp and their faces gray with exhaustion. The Christmas tree still glowed in the living room. The presents still sat wrapped beneath its branches, but the house felt hollow and silent. Emily's mother collapsed on the couch and sobbed into her hands, and Emily's father sat beside her, staring at the wall with empty eyes. Daniel went to his room and pulled the drawing from his nightstand, studying the woman in the red coat and the pocket watch. He wondered if Emily had seen this woman somewhere, if the drawing was meant to be a clue, but he could not make sense of it. He placed the drawing on his desk where he could see it, and lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling until sleep finally claimed him. The blizzard raged for 3 days, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow on Cedar Rapids and paralyzing the city. The search for Emily resumed on December 28th, but the fresh snow had covered any remaining evidence of where she might have gone. Volunteers returned, fewer in number but no less determined, and the police expanded their investigation to include interviews with sex offenders in the area and reviews of surveillance footage from businesses near the theater district. Emily's face appeared on the local news every evening, her school photograph enlarged and displayed beside her parents' tearful pleas for her safe return. Tips poured in from across Iowa and neighboring states, sightings of girls who resembled Emily in grocery stores and gas stations and shopping malls, but each lead turned out to be a false alarm. As the days turned into weeks, the search shifted from a rescue operation to a recovery effort, though no one in the Harper family was willing to say the words aloud. Emily's mother stopped eating, her cheeks growing hollow and her eyes sinking into dark circles. Her father threw himself into the investigation, spending hours at the police station reviewing reports and maps, refusing to accept that his daughter might not be coming home. Daniel returned to school in early January, moving through the halls like a ghost, unable to concentrate on his classes or talk to his friends. He kept Emily's drawing in his backpack, pulling it out during lunch to stare at the woman in the red coat, as though the image might suddenly reveal its secret. The police investigation continued through January and into February, but the leads grew colder with each passing day. Detectives interviewed Emily's teachers and classmates, her neighbors and extended family, but no one could offer any insight into where she might have gone or why. The theory that she had wandered off and succumbed to the cold was the most widely accepted, though extensive searches of parks and wooded areas around Cedar Rapids turned up nothing. Some investigators speculated that she had been abducted, perhaps by someone passing through the city on Christmas Eve, someone who saw an opportunity and took it. But there was no evidence of a struggle, no witnesses who had seen Emily with a stranger, no ransom demands or cryptic messages. She had simply vanished, as though the snow had swallowed her whole. By March, the case was officially declared cold, though it remained open and assigned to a detective who checked in with the family every few weeks. Emily's parents held a memorial service at the church where the search command post had been set up, inviting the volunteers who had spent so many nights combing the streets for their daughter. The sanctuary filled with people who had never met Emily, but who grieved for her nonetheless, moved by the tragedy of a child lost at Christmas. Emily's mother read a poem she had written about hope and loss, her voice breaking on every other word, and Daniel placed the drawing of the woman in the red coat on the altar, a silent tribute to his sister's imagination and the mystery she had left behind. The Harper family tried to move forward, though the absence of Emily was a wound that never healed. Her bedroom remained untouched, her stuffed animals arranged on the bed exactly as she had left them, her drawings still taped to the walls. Her parents attended grief counseling sessions and support groups for families of missing children, finding some measure of comfort in sharing their pain with others who understood. Daniel threw himself into his schoolwork, earning straight A's and earning a spot on the honor roll, as though academic success might somehow bring his sister back or make his parents proud enough to smile again. But the house on Birch Street remained a place of quiet sorrow, the laughter and chaos of childhood replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into the walls. 2 years passed, 2 long years marked by birthdays that went uncelebrated and holidays that felt like cruel reminders of what had been lost. Emily would have been 10 years old, no longer the small girl with the oversized eyes and the vivid imagination, but a child on the cusp of adolescence, perhaps already beginning to leave behind the fantasies of her early years. Her parents tried to imagine what she would look like, how her voice would sound, whether she would still love to draw or whether she would have discovered new interests. But these imaginings were painful, a form of torture that left them feeling emptier than before, and so they tried not to think about it, tried instead to focus on the routines of daily life and the small kindnesses they could offer one another. In late November of 2018, nearly 2 years after Emily's disappearance, the Cedar Rapids Police Department received a call from a detective in the cybercrime division who had been conducting a routine audit of abandoned surveillance footage from businesses in the city. The footage had been collected as part of an unrelated investigation into a series of thefts at a shopping mall near the theater district, and the detective had been tasked with reviewing hours of video to identify potential suspects. As he scrubbed through the footage, much of it grainy and poorly lit, he came across a clip dated December 24, 2016, from a camera mounted above the rear entrance of a storage facility adjacent to the mall. The clip showed a small figure in dark clothing slipping through a door that had been left ajar, the figure moving quickly and furtively, as though afraid of being seen. The detective paused the footage and zoomed in on the figure, his pulse quickening as he recognized the purple sweater and the dark hair. He cross-referenced the image with the missing person report for Emily Harper, his hands trembling as he pulled up the photograph of the girl who had vanished on Christmas Eve. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same round face and large eyes, the same slight build. He immediately contacted the lead detective on Emily's case, a veteran officer named Rodriguez, who had never fully let go of the investigation despite its cold status. Rodriguez arrived at the cybercrime office within the hour, and together the two men reviewed the footage frame by frame. The video showed Emily entering the storage facility at approximately 6:15 in the evening on December 24th, just minutes after she had been last seen in her front yard. She appeared to be alone, though the angle of the camera made it difficult to tell if someone was waiting for her inside. The footage from the camera inside the facility was corrupted, a technical glitch that had never been repaired, but the exterior camera captured Emily disappearing through the door and not re-emerging. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the clip, the possibilities swirling in his mind. If Emily had been inside the storage facility that night, why had she not been found during the initial search? And if she had been there for 2 years, how had she survived? Rodriguez pulled up the records for the storage facility and discovered that it was leased by a small retail business called Harper's Treasures, a store that sold vintage clothing and antique home goods. The name struck him as a cruel coincidence, and he immediately looked up the business owner, a woman named Margaret Calloway. Margaret had operated the store for 15 years, and by all accounts she was a respected member of the community, known for her charity work and her friendly demeanor. Rodriguez called Margaret's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He then contacted the mall's security office and requested access to the storage facility, his sense of urgency growing with every passing minute. The storage facility was located in a basement level of the mall, accessible only through a service corridor that most shoppers never saw. Rodriguez arrived with 2 uniformed officers and a locksmith, and together they descended the concrete stairs to the basement, their flashlights cutting through the dimness. The air was cold and stale, and the walls were lined with shelving units stacked with cardboard boxes and plastic bins. At the far end of the corridor was a metal door with a rusted padlock, and above the door was a sign that read, "Harper's Treasures Storage." Rodriguez's heart pounded as the locksmith worked on the padlock, the metallic clicks echoing in the confined space. When the lock finally gave way, Rodriguez pushed the door open and stepped inside. The storage room was larger than he had expected, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet, with high ceilings and bare concrete walls. The space was cluttered with racks of clothing and shelves of knickknacks, but in the far corner, tucked behind a rack of winter coats, was a makeshift bed made from folded blankets and a pillow. Beside the bed was a small collection of items that looked out of place among the vintage goods: a flashlight, a half-empty bottle of water, a package of crackers, and a series of drawings taped to the wall. Rodriguez approached the drawings slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the style. They were childlike and simple, depicting scenes of snow and Christmas trees and a small figure standing alone in the darkness. One of the drawings showed a woman in a red coat holding a pocket watch, the same image Daniel Harper had kept for 2 years. Rodriguez called for the officers to search the rest of the room, and within minutes they discovered more evidence that someone had been living there. There were empty food wrappers tucked into a corner, a plastic bucket that had been used as a makeshift toilet, and a cardboard box filled with holiday decorations, tinsel and ornaments, and a small plastic snowman. On one of the shelves was a notebook, its pages filled with childish handwriting, entries that detailed the long days and nights spent in the storage room, the fear and loneliness, and the desperate hope that someone would come. Rodriguez flipped through the pages, his eyes stinging with tears as he read Emily's words, her voice reaching out to him across the years. He immediately called for backup and requested that the mall be locked down, though it was late evening and most of the stores had already closed. He then contacted Emily's parents, his voice shaking as he told them that there was a development in their daughter's case, that they needed to come to the mall right away. He did not tell them what he had found, did not want to give them false hope until he was certain, but the urgency in his tone was enough to send them racing across the city, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate longing. Rodriguez left the storage room and made his way back to the security office, where he reviewed the rest of the surveillance footage from the mall. He discovered that Margaret Calloway's husband, a man named Robert Calloway, had been the one to access the storage facility on the night of December 24th, 2016. The footage showed Robert entering the facility at 6:30 in the evening, approximately 15 minutes after Emily had slipped inside. He emerged 20 minutes later, carrying a box, and locked the door behind him. Rodriguez pulled up Robert's background and discovered that he had no criminal record, no history of violence or suspicious behavior. He was a retired postal worker who helped his wife with her business, managing inventory and handling deliveries. Rodriguez called Margaret's cell phone again, and this time she answered. He identified himself and asked her to come to the mall immediately, along with her husband. Margaret sounded confused and concerned, but she agreed, saying they would be there within the hour. Rodriguez ended the call and returned to the storage room, where forensic technicians had begun processing the scene, collecting fingerprints and DNA samples and photographing every detail. The room felt heavy with the weight of what had happened there, the years of isolation and fear that Emily had endured, and Rodriguez found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure. When Margaret and Robert Calloway arrived at the mall, they were escorted to a small office where Rodriguez waited. Margaret was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes, and Robert was a tall man with a weathered face and calloused hands. They sat down across from Rodriguez, their expressions anxious, and he explained that he was investigating the disappearance of Emily Harper, a case that had gone cold 2 years earlier. He told them about the surveillance footage, about the evidence that someone had been living in their storage facility, and he watched as the color drained from their faces. Margaret gasped and covered her mouth with her hand, and Robert's eyes widened with shock. He began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush, explaining that he had gone to the storage facility on Christmas Eve 2016 to retrieve a box of ornaments for a customer. When he entered the room, he had found Emily huddled in the corner, shivering and crying. She had told him that she had followed the lights from the theater and had slipped into the storage room to get out of the cold. But the door had closed behind her, and she could not get it open again. Robert said he had panicked, unsure what to do, and he had given Emily a blanket and some food, and told her to stay quiet while he figured out how to help her. Rodriguez listened, his expression hardening as Robert continued. Robert admitted that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had been afraid of getting in trouble for leaving the door unlocked, afraid that people would think he had taken Emily on purpose. He said he had intended to call the police, to report that he had found her. But he had hesitated, and the longer he waited, the harder it became to come forward. He had returned to the storage room every few days to bring Emily food and water, telling himself that he was keeping her safe until he found the right moment to report her presence. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and he could not bring himself to admit what he had done. Margaret stared at her husband in horror, tears streaming down her face, and she demanded to know how he could have kept this from her, how he could have let a child suffer for 2 years. Robert buried his face in his hands and sobbed, saying he did not know, that he had been weak and foolish, and that he had convinced himself he was protecting Emily by keeping her hidden. He said he had not realized how much time had passed, that he had lost track of the days, and had somehow believed that Emily would eventually tell someone, and the truth would come out. But Emily had been too afraid to speak, too traumatized by the isolation and the fear, and she had simply endured. Rodriguez arrested Robert Calloway on the spot, charging him with kidnapping and child endangerment, and he arranged for Margaret to be escorted home. He then returned to the storage room, where Emily's parents had arrived, their faces pale and their hands clutching each other. Rodriguez led them inside, and they stood in the doorway, staring at the makeshift bed and the drawings on the wall. Emily's mother let out a strangled cry and collapsed to her knees, and her father wrapped his arms around her, his own tears falling freely. Daniel stood behind them, holding the drawing of the woman in the red coat, and he looked at the matching image on the wall, the connection finally clear. The search for Emily shifted to a rescue operation, with every available officer and volunteer mobilized to find her. Rodriguez believed that Robert had been telling the truth about keeping Emily in the storage room, but he needed to confirm that she was no longer there, that Robert had not moved her to another location. The forensic team processed the room for hours, collecting evidence and documenting every detail, while search teams fanned out across the mall and surrounding areas. It was not until the early hours of the morning that an officer discovered a loose panel in the back wall of the storage room, a panel that opened onto a narrow crawl space that ran along the perimeter of the basement. The officer called for backup, and together they removed the panel and shone their flashlights into the crawl space. The beam of light revealed a small figure curled up in the darkness, wrapped in a blanket, barely moving. Rodriguez pushed his way through the opening and crawled toward the figure, his heart pounding, and when he reached her, he gently touched her shoulder and whispered her name. Emily's eyes fluttered open, and she stared at him with a mixture of confusion and fear, her face thin and pale, her hair matted and dirty. Rodriguez told her that she was safe, that her family was waiting for her, and he carefully lifted her into his arms and carried her out of the crawl space. The paramedics were waiting in the storage room, and they immediately began checking Emily's vital signs, wrapping her in warm blankets and starting an IV to rehydrate her. Emily said nothing, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the faces of the strangers who surrounded her. When her parents rushed forward, their hands reaching for her, she flinched and pulled back, and her mother's face crumpled with grief. The paramedics explained that Emily was in shock, that it would take time for her to process what had happened and to feel safe again. They loaded her onto a stretcher and carried her out of the basement, her parents following close behind. Emily was taken to the hospital, where she was admitted for observation and treatment. The doctors found that she was severely malnourished and dehydrated, her muscles weakened from lack of use, but she had no serious physical injuries. The psychological damage, however, was profound. Emily spoke only in whispers, her voice so soft that people had to lean in close to hear her, and she refused to make eye contact with anyone except her mother. She startled at sudden noises and cried when the lights were turned off, clinging to her mother's hand as though afraid she might disappear again. The hospital assigned a child psychologist to work with Emily, and over the course of several days, the psychologist began to piece together the story of what had happened. Emily told the psychologist that she had followed the lights from the theater on Christmas Eve because she thought they were beautiful, like something from one of her stories. She had not meant to go far, had only wanted to see the lights up close, but she had gotten turned around in the snow and had ended up at the mall. She had seen the door to the storage facility standing open, and she had gone inside to get warm, thinking she would only stay for a few minutes. But the door had closed behind her, and she could not open it from the inside. She had called for help, but no one had heard her, and she had been too afraid to break anything or make too much noise. When Robert had found her, she had been relieved, thinking he would take her home, but he had told her to stay quiet and had locked her in the room. He had brought her food and water, but he had also told her that her parents did not want her anymore, that they had stopped looking for her, and that she would be in trouble if she tried to leave. Emily had believed him, her 8-year-old mind unable to comprehend the cruelty of the lie, and she had stayed in the storage room, waiting for someone to come and tell her she could go home. She had drawn pictures to pass the time, pictures of the life she remembered and the people she missed, and she had made decorations from the items in the storage room, trying to create a sense of comfort in the darkness. The story of Emily's disappearance and miraculous return spread quickly, making headlines across the country and sparking debates about child safety and the failures of the initial search. Robert Calloway was tried and convicted of kidnapping and child endangerment, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Margaret Calloway was not charged with any crime, as investigators found no evidence that she had known about Emily's captivity. But the guilt and shame destroyed her. She closed her store and moved away from Cedar Rapids, unable to face the community that had once respected her. Emily's recovery was slow and painful, marked by setbacks and small victories. She attended therapy sessions 3 times a week, working through the trauma of her captivity and learning to trust again. Her parents were patient and gentle, giving her space when she needed it, and holding her close when she allowed it. Daniel became her constant companion, reading to her and playing games with her, trying to help her remember the girl she had been before the storage room. Gradually, over the course of months, Emily began to speak more freely, her voice growing stronger, her laughter returning in small bursts that filled the house on Birch Street with a tentative joy. The family kept one of the ornaments Emily had made in the storage room, a small angel fashioned from tinsel and cardboard, its wings bent and its halo crooked. They hung it on the Christmas tree every year, a reminder of the darkness they had endured and the light they had found. Emily grew older, the trauma of her captivity fading but never disappearing, and she learned to carry it with her, a part of her story but not the whole of it. She became an advocate for missing children, speaking at events and fundraisers, using her voice to help others who had suffered as she had. The Harper family learned to live with the scars, to honor the pain and the survival, and to find hope in the small moments of connection and love. The house on Birch Street was no longer a place of silence, but a home filled with laughter and memories, both old and new. And every Christmas Eve, they stood together in the living room, looking at the crooked angel on the tree, and they remembered the girl who had vanished into the snow and the long, difficult road that had brought her home.